When the marriage is blank, when the child runs away, when the finances don't reach, when the pews are bare, when the friends forsake you, the question is far bigger than how do you live, but how do you preach next Sunday?
How did Charles Spurgeon continue to preach week after week when his life was marked by deep suffering? To answer that question, John Piper begins a two-part biographical series on Charles Spurgeon's perseverance through suffering. This talk was originally given at the Desiring God 1995 Conference for Pastors.
My topic this year is preaching through adversity. And the man that I would like us to focus on is Charles Haddon Spurgeon, who on this day, January 31st, 103 years ago, died at the age of 57 after preaching for 38 years at the Metropolitan Tabernacle in London. And there are very personal reasons for me why I chose the topic and why I chose the man for this biographical study this year. Everybody faces adversity, without exception, in the world, and everybody must learn how to live through adversity. Everybody has to get up in the morning and make breakfast and wash clothes and go to work and pay bills and discipline children and generally keep life going when the heart is breaking. But it's different. It's not totally different, but it's different for pastors, for preachers, because the heart is the instrument of our vocation. Spurgeon said, "Ours is more than mental work. It is heart work, the labor of our inmost soul." So when our heart is breaking, we must labor with a broken instrument. And preaching is heart work, not just mental work. So the question for us is not just how do you live through adversity, but a much more difficult question. How do you preach through adversity? When the marriage is blank, when the child runs away, when the finances don't reach, when the pews are bare, when the friends forsake you, the question is far bigger than how do you live, but how do you preach next Sunday? And week after week and month after month. It's one thing to survive adversity. It's another thing to preach through adversity. Spurgeon said to his pastor's college once, "One crushing stroke has sometimes laid the minister very low. The brother most relied upon becomes a traitor. 10 years of toil do not take so much life out of us as we lose in a few hours by Ahithophel, the traitor, or Demas, the apostate." The question for us is not how do you live through unremitting criticism and distrust and accusation and abandonment. For us, the question is, how do you preach through it? How do you do heart work when the heart is under siege week after week and ready to fall? For just over a year now, that has been probably the uppermost question in my life. And if I'm not mistaken, it is an uppermost question for many of you. Preaching great and glorious truth in an atmosphere that is not great and glorious is a great difficulty. To be reminded week in and week out that many people regard your preaching of the glory of the grace of God as sheer hypocrisy pushes a preacher not just into the hills of introspection, but to the precipice of self-extinction. And I don't mean suicide, I mean something far more complex than suicide. I mean the deranging inability to know any longer who you are. What begins as a searching introspection for the sake of holiness and humility gradually becomes, for various reasons, a carnival of mirrors. Picture the scene now. Week after week, relentless, many of you know exactly what I'm talking about, criticism. Pushes you first to introspection because you want to be humble, you want to be holy, you want to listen to the truth in what's being said. You don't want to elevate yourself above correction. But it pushes you beyond introspection to this deranging inability to know anymore who you are if you're not careful. What begins with that searching introspection for the sake of holiness and humility gradually becomes, for various reasons, a carnival of mirrors in your soul. You look into one mirror and you're short and fat. And then you look into another mirror and you're tall and skinny. And you look into another mirror and you're upside down. And little by little, you start to tremble that you don't know which one is you. The center isn't holding. And if the center doesn't hold, if there is no fixed, solid I, able to relate to the fixed and solid thou, namely God, who will preach next Sunday? Which one will preach? When the Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15:10, by the grace of God, I am what I am, he said something that is so utterly essential for enduring in the preaching office through adversity. If by grace the identity of the I created by Christ and united to Christ, but still the human I, if that center doesn't hold, there will be no more authentic preaching, because there will be no more authentic preacher, but only a collection of echoes. Echoing off of this feedback and that feedback and this feedback and this feedback, and just a collection of echoes with no center anymore. And oh, how fortunate we are, brothers of the pulpit, that we are not the first to face these things. We are so fortunate. I thank God for the healing of history. Do you read history? Are you slipping into the abyss of the present? It is an abyss, brothers. You cannot know yourself or your times or your God if you only know the present. I bless God for history and books. And I have turned to Charles Spurgeon in these days, and I have been helped. And that's what I want to do for you, is help you the way I've been helped. My aim is to give strength so that you'll keep on preaching through the adversity until Darius arises and pays your bill. Why Spurgeon? I think I've got about 7 reasons here. Number 1, he was a preacher. He preached 600 times before he was 20 years old. His sermons were sold at the rate of about 25,000 a week. He was a preacher. 600 times before he was 20, 25,000 copies a week went out. The collected volumes, you know these from Pilgrim Press down in Pasadena, 63 volumes, equal to the 9th edition of the 27 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica, the biggest collection of writings of any Christian writer in the whole world and the whole of history. He stands alone. His son Charles is biased, but he speaks truth, I think, when he says, "There was no one who could preach like my father. He must, at least in my opinion, ever be regarded as the prince of preachers." So number one reason he was a preacher, we are preachers. Number two, he was a truth-driven preacher. I am not interested in the counsel of anyone going through adversity who does not find the solution to that challenge in the truth. If he wants to give me other kinds of counsel and abandon the truth in order to survive, I turn away from that counsel. That's not Spurgeon. He is truth-driven. He defined the work of preaching like this: to know the truth and to love it as it should be loved, and to proclaim it in the right spirit in its proper proportions. So he defined preaching in terms of truth, dissemination, and recognition. He said to his students, to be an effective preacher, you must be a sound theologian. He warned that those who do away with Christian doctrine, whether they are aware of it or not, are the worst enemies of Christian living, because the coals of orthodoxy are necessary to the fire of piety. 2 years before he died, he said this. This was so significant to me. He's just filled with imagery, as you know. Here's one of them. Some excellent brethren seem to think more of life than of truth. In my controversy, the issue is love versus truth. That's more common today. And when I warn them that the enemy has poisoned the children's bread, they answer, dear brother, we are sorry to hear it. And to counteract the evil, we will open the window and give the children fresh air. Yes, open the window and give them fresh air by all means. But at the same time, this you ought to have done and not to have left the other undone. Arrest the poisoners and open the windows too. While men go on preaching false doctrine, you may talk as often as you like about deepening their spiritual life, but you will fail in it. Doctrinal truth was at the foundation and the superstructure of his preaching in life. Number three, why Spurgeon? He was a Bible-believing preacher. The truth was biblical truth. Here's what he said about the Bible. These words are God's words. Thou book of vast authority, thou art a proclamation from the Emperor of heaven. Far be it from me to exercise my reason in contradicting thee. This is the book untainted by error, but it is pure, unalloyed, perfect truth. Why? Because God wrote it. Number four, he was a soul-winning preacher. There wasn't 1 week, he said, went by, but that his written sermons did not win somebody to Jesus. Not to mention the many that were saved week in and week out at the tabernacle. He did what he called the watch for souls. He put his elders on watch, and he had one brother, he said, who earned the name for himself, my hunting dog, for he's always ready to pick up the wounded bird. Spurgeon, like John commended us this morning, pled for decision, sought decision, and got decision that were deep and life-changing. He wasn't exaggerating when he said, I remember When I have preached at different times in the country, and sometimes here, that my whole soul was agonized over men. Every nerve of my body has been strained, and I could have wept my very being out of my eyes and carried my whole frame into a flood of tears if I could but win souls. He was consumed with the glory of God and the salvation of men. I'm interested in hearing a man like that and how he perseveres in adversity. Number 5, why Spurgeon? He was a Calvinistic preacher. My kind of Calvinist, I believe. Let me give you a flavor of his Calvinism and why it drew 5,000 people a week instead of sending 5,000 people a week away from it. To me, he said, Calvinism means the placing of the eternal God at the head of all things. I look at everything through its relation to the glory of God. That couldn't define my view of Calvinism better. I look at everything in relation to the glory of God. I see God first and man far down the list. Brethren, if we live in sympathy with God, we delight to hear Him say, I am God and there is none else. The spirit of that is what he meant by the spirit of Calvinism. He said this, Puritanism, Protestantism, Calvinism, poor names which the world has given to our great and glorious faith, the doctrine of Paul the Apostle and Jesus our Savior. But he did make distinctions now. He did make distinctions between the full system, which he embraced, and some central evangelical doctrines shared by others who didn't embrace the whole system, which bound him together with them. For example, most precious to him, the doctrine of the substitutionary atonement of Christ, which he thought was at the center of all things. He said, far be it from me to imagine that Zion contains none but Calvinistic Christians within her walls, or that there are none saved who do not hold our views. He said, I am not an outrageous Protestant generally. I rejoice to confess that I feel sure there are some of God's people even in the Romish church. He chose a pedo-Baptist as the first principal of his pastor's college. Blew my mind away when I read that. I wouldn't do that, I don't think. And he did not make being a pedo-Baptist a prerequisite for preaching in his pulpit, though he said, I would rather give up my pastorate than admit any man to the church who's not obedient to the Lord's command of baptism. So it was a prerequisite for membership in his local church. His first words in the Metropolitan Tabernacle that he built there with so many seats that he could preach to, his first words were these. I would propose that the subject of the ministry in this house, as long as this platform shall stand, shall be the person of Jesus Christ. I am never ashamed to avow myself a Calvinist. I do not hesitate to take the name of Baptist. But if I am asked what is my creed, I reply, it is Jesus Christ. He preached Calvinism because he believed it honored this Christ more fully than any other system of doctrine. And he preached it explicitly, and he tried to build it into the minds of his people, not just slip it in sideways. He said, Calvinism has in it a conservative force which helps to hold men to vital truth. I think that is right and very, very significant. It has a conservative force which, if you believe, it holds you to many, many other things that are of importance. And therefore he was unashamed in his preaching, and he said this, people come to me for one thing. I preach to them a Calvinistic creed and a Puritan morality. That is what they want. That is what they get. If they want anything else, they must go elsewhere. Number 6, he was a hard-working preacher. I don't want to go to a soft and leisurely man when I'm going through adversity and have him say, what you need is a vacation. That may be true. But if that's the sum of his counsel to me, I will go to another counselor. This man worked several lives, even though he died at 57. He did the work of 50 men, according to Lord Shaftesbury. He wrote, no one living knows the toil and care I have to bear. I have to look after the orphanage. I have a church with 4,000 members. Sometimes there are marriages and burials to be undertaken. There's the weekly sermon to be revised. There's the sword and trowel, the magazine to be edited. And besides all that, a weekly average of 500 letters to be answered. This, however, is only half of my duty. For there are the innumerable churches established by my friends, with the affairs of which I am closely connected, to say nothing of the cases of difficulty which are constantly being referred to me. At his 50th birthday celebration, they listed 66 institutions he had founded and was overseeing. He typically read 6 books of substantial theology every week and could remember what he read and tell you where it was found. So forget all imitation right now. Just relax, okay? I used to read history for imitation purposes, and now I read it for gratitude that God creates such impossible people to admire. There are a few things we might be able to imitate, but forget, he had a mind that was in a class by itself. He often worked 18 hours a day. David Livingstone, the missionary, asked him one time, how do you manage to do 2 men's work in a single day? And Spurgeon replied, you have forgotten there are 2 of us. And I think he meant Colossians 1:29, where Paul said, I labor, striving according to his power, which mightily works within me. There are 2 of us. Spurgeon's attitude towards sacrificial labor would not go over today, where wellness is a great priority. He said, if by excessive labor we die before reaching the average age of man, worn out in the Master's service, then glory be to God. We shall have so much less of earth and so much more of heaven. It is our duty and our privilege to exhaust our lives for Jesus. We are not to be living specimens of men in fine preservation, but living sacrifices whose lot is to be consumed. He will qualify that in a few minutes, but that was the temperament of his life. I think the word indefatigable was created for people like Spurgeon. Finally, number 7, why Spurgeon? He was a maligned and suffering preacher that makes him a prime candidate for counseling me in my question. And I have 6 ways or so that he was maligned and suffered. Number 1, he knew the everyday homegrown variety of frustration and disappointment of lukewarm church members. He said, you know what one cold-hearted man can do if he gets at you on Sunday morning with a lump of ice and freezes you with the information that Mrs. Smith and all her family are offended and their pew is vacant? You did not want to know of that lady's protest just before entering the pulpit, and it does not help you. Or perhaps worse, after the sermon, what terrible blankets some professors are. Their remarks after a sermon are enough to stagger you. You have been pleading as for life or death, and they have been calculating how many seconds the sermon occupied and grudging you the 5 odd minutes beyond the usual hour. I tell you, it is a cold thing to the soul to pour your heart out and have somebody say, "Why did he stand in front of the candles when he sang?" Number 2, he also knew the extraordinary calamities that befall us once in a lifetime. October 19, 1856. The music hall, the Royal Surrey Gardens, 10,000 people gathered to hear him preach. He's 22 years old, and someone in the service cries, "Fire!" And there is a huge panic and a stampede, and 7 people are crushed and killed, and dozens are hurt. And the press rips him to shreds, and he must be carried away. And he says, "Perhaps never soul went so near the burning furnace of insanity, and yet came away unharmed." And not all of his friends believed he came away unharmed. One of his friends and biographers said, "I cannot but think from what I saw that his comparatively early death might be in some measure due to the furnace of mental suffering he endured on and after that fearful night."
This is Light and Truth, God-centered preaching to help you see Christ clearly and treasure Him truly. I'm your host, Dan Kruver. Thank you for listening. On our next episode, John Piper continues our 2-part series on Charles Spurgeon with a message titled, Dependence Through Depression. I hope you'll join us. For more resources, visit desiringgod.org.